In the 2010 video game Mass Effect 2, the player's character, Commander Shepard, collects a team of specialists for what is likely to be a suicide mission. Each new addition to the crew has some unfinished business that they'd like to accomplish before joining up. Personal goals are called loyalty missions in this game. A joke about these loyalty missions is that everyone has daddy issues. That's not really true for every single character, but you don't have to stretch the statement too far to understand why that joke is applied to the game. For instance, the character Thane is a father with unresolved issues with his son. See, it's his son that has the daddy issues. Thane spent much of his life honing skills as an assassin. That's the expertise that he brings to the suicide mission, despite the fact that he hadn't used those skills for quite some time. This is because when he had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, Thane had begun to look at his life differently. He tried to live more peaceably in the world. Although the damage to his family had already been done, so he didn't really have much of a role in his son's life. That is, until after the player meets him in the game. During the adventure, Thane learns that young Kolyat has picked up his father's old contacts and is in the beginning stages of becoming an assassin like his father had been. And so, Thane asks Shepard to help him keep his son from falling into the same terrible life choices that he'd made. To keep Kolyat from ending up exactly like his father, sins and all. The concept of the sins of the father visiting upon his children is not a new one, whether in fictional stories or in real life. We know that negative thinking patterns, poor lifestyle choices, sins, and so many other bad habits are often generational. They may not look exactly the same from one generation to the next, but there are enough consistencies to witness a pattern from parent to child to grandparent and beyond. No one, or at least very few people, intend to pass their sins and bad habits onto their children. But it happens so often that we even have a pithy little saying like this. The problem is that the cycle is difficult to break. For some, it's because the parents are blind to the problem, and so don't see it until after the child has already picked up the negative habit. For others, the parent knows very well that the sin exists, but they find it difficult to discipline the fault out of their child, because they feel like a hypocrite for speaking into something that they once did, no matter how wrong they know the action to be. No matter how much they know its detriment, they allow shame to steal their authoritative voice. And this difficult-to-break cycle is something that transcends time and geography and culture. As a matter of fact, as we move to 2 Samuel chapter 13 in our series through the book of Samuel, we'll see that even David dealt with this issue of passing on his sins to his children. If you remember, his sins sounded like they would fit right in with the grimdark fantasy novel series, and the sins passed on to his children go right along with his, although theirs amp up the volume on their daddy's issues. In chapter 11, we witness David's adultery with Bathsheba and the conspiratorial murder of her husband Uriah. And in chapter 12, we saw that even though David eventually repented, he'd have to experience the consequences of his sins. Those consequences including the peace of his own family being disrupted and the sword never leaving his line. All of this is important for us to remember as we move on to chapter 13, because we can break down the chapter into two stories, each of which has 3 parts. The importance comes from the fact that the 2 stories correspond to the 2 areas of sin that David passed on to his children, namely sexual sin and violent murder. And both stories are recounted through their respective 3-part conspiracy: the conspiracy planned, the conspiracy performed, and the conspiracy's results. Thus, as we take a look at the wretched acts of David's children, we must keep in mind that their inclusion in the book of Samuel is to show how deeply the consequences can run because of our own sins. They remind us that some of the human evil that brings about the problems in other people's lives comes directly on account of our own sinful actions, and those sins which are passed on to the next generation. We are the reason why some people need God's king to bring restoration to them. It's not good, obviously, but it is true nonetheless, and parents often pass on that trait to their children. These 2 true stories should cause us to reconsider our own actions, because the sins of the father often do become the sins of his children, and God's perspective on both is not good. With that said, let's turn to the first story of David's children, and we begin with this story that speaks of sexual sin. And this time there was no denying the fact that this sexual act was non-consensual. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's look at the story's conspiratorial plan. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 to 5. Now Absalom, David's son, had a beautiful sister, whose name was Tamar. And after a time Amnon, David's son, loved her. And Amnon was so tormented that he made himself ill because of his sister Tamar, for she was a virgin, and it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. But Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother. And Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said to him, "O son of the king, Why are you so haggard morning after morning? Will you not tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Jonadab said to him, "Lie down on your bed and pretend to be ill. And when your father comes to see you, say to him, 'Let my sister Tamar come and give me bread to eat, and prepare the food in my sight that I may see it and eat it from her hand.'" I know, that's a lot of names for so few verses. But knowing who's who will be important for the whole sermon, so let's break this down. Other than David, we have our 4 main characters, and Tamar is the only woman in the bunch, so there's no mistaking this princess for anyone else in the story. She is the beautiful daughter of David. There are a lot of pretty people in David's family, and Tamar is no exception. Her fully biological brother is Absalom, who is David's 3rd oldest son. Tamar and Absalom have the same mother, who is the daughter of a king herself. The fact that these siblings have a grandfather on their mother's side who is also a king will come into play later on in this chapter. Now, Absalom doesn't play that big of a role in this first story, but is the main area of connection between the 2 stories. Plus, Absalom will continue to play a role in the upcoming chapters. To help you picture him, he's the one son of David that is also called pretty, like his father before him. We might ask why Absalom is named first in the chapter, if he doesn't have a primary role in this first story. One reason being the fact that he takes on the primary role for the next few chapters. So his name being first really clarifies that these are the Absalom years of David's reign, the meaning of which we'll see as the chapters go on. And the second reason for Absalom's primary place in this chapter comes from the irony of his name, given this section's connection to David's consequences for his sins. You see, Absalom means father of peace, but this section largely is about how peace is removed from David's family. Right now, there won't be peace for this father. Irony. Anyway, back to the characters. Like I said, you have Tamar and her full brother Absalom, David's 3rd oldest son. Then we're introduced to Amnon. He is David's eldest, the one most likely to be considered David's heir, the one who would be expected to take the throne after David based off of the methodologies of their surrounding nations. But we've already seen that God doesn't really follow the ways of other nations when it comes to who sits on the throne of his people, so don't expect too much from this Amnon. And our final introduced character is Jonadab, the son of David's brother. So he's good old cousin Jonadab, a friend of Amnon, and an advisor as well, because we see in verse 3 that he is a very crafty man. The word for crafty is actually the word for wise, but his wisdom wasn't used for good, as we've already seen while reading the passage. But he still had a mind for strategy. In the story, he takes on the trickster role, but the kind of trickster that is the antagonist. Now, with our main characters more clear in our head, let's get on to the actual story. Amnon spent day after day yearning for his beautiful half-sister. Now, while David's lust in chapter 11 had been from one look that led to a rather quick action of getting Bathsheba into bed, Amnon not only saw the beauty of his sister Tamar, but kept looking, and leering, and ogling, and lusting after her. He is a grade A creeper, which is disgusting enough, but is also an incestuous creeper to boot. Amnon thought so much about getting his half-sister into bed that he started planning on how it could happen. But there was one problem. Well, only one as far as he was concerned. We know that there are a whole lot of problems with this, most of which come from his direction. But for Amnon, there was one problem. That was the fact that Tamar was a virgin. If he were to try anything with Tamar, his act would be obvious, because proving a loss of virginity was not that difficult. On top of that, it seemed that it was difficult to gain access to the virgin daughters of David, even for the likely inheritor of his father's throne. So Amnon literally made himself sick trying to figure out a plan to gain access to his half-sister, to have his unspeakably disgusting way with her. And after days and months of his sick pining, in walks cousin Jonadab. He looks at Amnon and is like, "You look terrible, cousin. What is wrong with you? You hardly look like the next king of Israel. Let me help." And Amnon looks around and sighs, and he's like, "It's Tamar. I love her, but there's nothing I can do to get to her." And at this, Jonadab offers up a plan. I can't help but wonder if the crafty cousin knows that the prince will just want to sate his sexual appetite, instead of wanting a long-term relationship, both of which are disgusting. But either way, the plan is not great. Jonadab uses Amnon's weakening appearance to their benefit. He tells Amnon to play sick, and when the king comes to tend on his son, because we know that David cares deeply for his children's health, then Amnon should ask David to send Tamar to make some food for him in his presence. Now, if a royal descendant were to suddenly fall sick without having any known disease being the culprit, it would say to me that the prince was being poisoned. So, having a trusted member of the family make his food in his presence makes sense to me, and it would put to rest any questioning of poisoning. I'm not sure if that's the angle Jonadab was going for, but it makes the most sense to me for what their plan was. And so the conspiracy would allow the easiest access for Amnon to be with Tamar, with very few other obstacles to get in his way. As disturbing as the plan was, Amnon performed it perfectly. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 6 to 18. So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. And when the king came to see him, Amnon said to the king, "Please let my sister Tamar come and make a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat them from her hand." Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, "Go to your brother Amnon's house and prepare food for him." So Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house, where he was lying down. And she took dough and kneaded it, and made cakes in his sight, and baked the cakes. And she took the pan and emptied it out before him. But he refused to eat. And Amnon said, "Send out everyone from me." So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food into the chamber, that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not violate me. For such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now therefore please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her with very great hatred, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said to him, "Put this woman out of my presence, and bolt the door after her." Now she was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for thus the virgin daughters of the king dressed. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. As predicted, David came to see his supposedly ill son, and Amnon spoke Jonadab's script to the letter, asking for Tamar to feed him. The request made sense enough to David that he had no questions about it, and sent his beautiful daughter to care for her half-brother. Tamar goes without question, as her father asked. The passage goes into great detail of all the steps she took in making the food, kneading the dough, shaping it, putting it in the oven, taking it out, letting it cool, removing it from the pan. I'm not sure if this is because the author's trying to emphasize how completely unsuspecting everyone throughout this entire charade was, or if the author's just trying to prolong this moment of innocence before he has to write about the terrible act about to happen. But either way, the elaborate details take a while to get through. That is, until the story comes to the rape. Amnon refuses to eat, because that wasn't the appetite he was hoping to please, and he sends everyone else out of his presence, while he asks Tamar to come with him to his bedroom. And still unsuspecting, Tamar follows with food in hand. And then Amnon reveals his true intent. We don't need details of what he's doing while Tamar is grasping for any sort of release valve from the horror that she is experiencing. She knows that Amnon is far stronger in a physical sense, so she tries to fend him off with her words. She reminds him that they are siblings, as she calls him my brother. She calls his intent out as an outrageously evil deed. And when none of that works, she asks him to consider what shame his act would place upon her, how impossible it would be for her to have a normal life afterwards. She also speaks of how it would forever name him as a reprehensible, morally bankrupt fool. But Amnon wasn't thinking about anything past these next few minutes. In a last-ditch effort, Tamar even speaks into her rapist's foolishness. If Amnon were to tell their father that he wanted Tamar as wife, then, she says, David wouldn't keep her from him. I doubt she was thinking that merely incest would be better than incestuous rape, but rather, I wonder, if she's just hoping for a second of consideration that would give her the time to escape. But Amnon would have none of it. He sated his dreadfully sinful appetite, and then threw her out like garbage. Verse 15 says that Amnon now hated her with more hate than he supposedly had loved her before. His vocabulary even proves that. In the Hebrew, what he says to her are two words. Two clipped, harsh words. Basically, up, out. And then calling a servant, Amnon tells them to send this woman out. Literally in the Hebrew it says, "Put this one out of my presence." We can almost read, "Get rid of this thing for me." When we think of others as objects to sate our own various sinful appetites, we will eventually treat them as objects, and often objects that can be tossed to the side once we've had our way with them. You might not like the fact that this application places us on the rapist's side, but every time we selfishly use someone else for our own sinful desires, we are closer to that side of the story than Tamar's. Let's consider that whenever the thought of our own sinful conspiracies arise in our heads. The whole time that Amnon treats her as an object to be tossed to the side, Tamar cries out that this throwing her out like trash is even worse than the rape. He's leaving her with no option for life. He stole from her any possible future, and now isn't even living up to the supposed love that he claimed he had just a few minutes ago. But the wicked prince continues to not listen, and Tamar finds herself also less strong than the servant who kicked her out of the house, and she's left, tossed out on the street, in clothes that mocked what she had just lost. Because the clothes, particularly the sleeves of the dress, indicated that she was one of the virgin daughters of David's line. And so we come to the first story's results. Tamar grieves what she's lost, but Absalom comforts his sister with a conspiracy of vengeance. Cold vengeance. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 19 to 22. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. But her brother Absalom said to her, Has Absalom your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart. So Tamar lived, a desolate woman, in her brother Absalom's house. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon, because he had violated his sister Tamar. The truth of what had happened would eventually get out, so Tamar decides not to hide it. She goes in full mourning mode. Ashes on her head, torn clothes. Just like how her virginity had been ripped from her, so too her torn clothes and probably torn off sleeves tell the story for her. She raises the alarm for all to see. And one of those who saw her was her full brother Absalom. He figured out pretty quickly what had happened. Probably like a good brother, he listened to Tamar speak and tried to comfort her as best as he could. Certain aspects couldn't be undone or fixed, but at least he could see to her welfare for the rest of her life. Take responsibility for her when no one else would. Some might look at Absalom's words in verse 20 and question how comforting he could be for his sister. After all, he tells her to hold her peace and not take it to heart. Two things that sound like terrible words to a rape victim. But as I see it, we shouldn't read these words as just forget it and move on with your life. Rather, because I've read the rest of the story, I believe that we should read these words as Absalom's invitation for Tamar to wait for the time for their conspiracy of vengeance. Amnon would pay for his vile deed, but not right now. No, when the moment is right. Because the idea of vengeance being best served cold also is not a recent saying. Some of us probably want to see David step in and execute justice. I mean, he's the king, the father of both parties involved. If there was ever a time that no one could step in the way of justice being served, it was here. And we get so close to that justice when we read verse 21 and see David hear about the situation and get angry. But notice that he makes no move toward justice here. We can even preview the first few words of verse 23. After 2 full years. And see that David does nothing in the face of this terrible sexual sin, the violation of one of his own daughters. Anger wells up in us. We want to ask David why there was no word about punishment. Why was there no justice here? He doesn't even take care of his own violated daughter. Her brother has to do that. We scream for justice that does not happen and ask why. And this is where we remember that many a parent has witnessed their child do something so much like their own failings, and because of their feelings of hypocrisy refuse to say or do anything about it. They know it's wrong. The sin of the child should be called out, that the child should be disciplined for it. But memories of their own past failings leave the parent in silence and leave room for more sin, which is exactly what happens for the second story of the chapter. This one following up the sexual sin with murder. So let's take a look at this conspiracy planned. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 23 to 28. After 2 full years, Absalom had sheep shearers at Baal Hazor, which is near Ephraim. And Absalom invited all the king's sons. And Absalom came to the king and said, Behold, your servant has sheep shearers. Please let the king and his servants go with your servant. And the king said to Absalom, No, my son, let us not all go, lest we be burdensome to you. He pressed him, but he would not go, but he gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, If not, please let my brother Amnon go with us. And the king said to him, Why should he go with you? But Amnon pressed him until he let Amnon and all the king's sons go with him. Then Absalom commanded his servants, Mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I say to you, Strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not fear. Have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. Again, we have to pause after that statement of 2 full years passing. There is no excuse for this passing of time with absolutely no consequences other than the brothers not talking to one another. And other than Absalom conspiring to strike at just the right moment against his fool of an older half-brother. I'm sure this moment was not the first time Absalom had tried to put his plans into motion. But it did become his moment. And he'd hide it under the guise of a celebration. Sheep shearing time was such an occasion, as we saw back when David met another fool named Nabal, and gained Abigail as wife. So Absalom invited all of his brothers to his place for a feast. And just so that things would seem less conspicuous, Absalom invited his father as well. But, just as expected, David declined the offer in the name of not being a burden upon his son's hospitality. To invite the king and his entire entourage would be quite a number of guests. But I also wonder if part of David's refusal was in an effort to not have to look at his violated daughter in the face again. Because Tamar, although not technically an active character in this story, was still under the hospitality of Absalom. She would be part of the household that celebrated the sheep shearing. I freely admit that I am reading this into the text, but that is a reflection of my own anger at the lack of injustice in this case. Back to the passage, we do see that Absalom uses this moment to also invite Amnon to the celebration. But David asks why that invitation would happen. After all, he knows full well that Absalom had not spoken a word to Amnon since that day. And he knows why that is. So the invitation feels out of nowhere. But Absalom uses his own words to convince his father into doing something. After repeated attempts and half-lie explanations, Absalom finally gets his way. Amnon's coming to dinner, and he won't eat much of this meal either. Absalom quickly goes home and prepares his servants for the conspiracy. When I tell you, smite Amnon in his seat. The cunning aspect of the plan has already been accomplished. The rest will need to be direct. Likely some of the servants look around and wonder if they're being called into something terrible. I mean, they are killing a prince, after all. But Absalom reassures them with words that seem to evoke the same "be strong and courageous" that General Joab had called upon a handful of chapters ago. I think that Absalom is trying to indicate to his servants that this murder conspiracy was the will of Yahweh, that they were supposedly being God's agents of justice in this act. But there was no justice in this moment. This conspiracy of murder was no more a part of God's plan than any other human evil that God's king restores us from. Despite that, the servants buy Absalom's words, and they perform his plan exactly. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 29 to 33. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, each one mounted his mule and fled. While they were on the way, news came to David. Absalom has struck down all the king's sons, and not one of them is left. Then the king arose and tore his garments and lay on the earth. And all the servants who were standing by tore their garments. But Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, said, Let not my lord suppose that they have killed all the young men, the king's sons, for Amnon alone is dead. For by the command of Absalom this has been determined from the day that he violated his sister Tamar. Now therefore let not my lord the king so take it to heart, as to suppose that all the king's sons are dead, for Amnon alone is dead. Just as commanded, Absalom's servants play Pierce a Prince with the king's eldest son. It looks so much like Absalom is trying to make a play for the throne, instead of getting vengeance for his sister's rape, that all the rest of the princes up and run. They did not want to see if there would be a second course to this murder. And apparently, one of the servants broke free faster than anyone else, because news of the deed makes it to David's ears before they arrive. Well, at least some of the news, because news of Absalom's deed was grossly overestimated. David is told that all of his sons other than Absalom were dead, and so he grieves for his supposedly dead sons, and the rest of the royal court follow suit, all of them except good old cousin Jonadab. He was wise enough to read the situation, might have even warned Amnon that this would happen. They were friends, after all. This is why Jonadab explained that they would come to hear that only Amnon had died. This was just a brother getting vengeance for his sister, not a play for the throne. No, that'll come in the next couple chapters. Sorry, spoilers. And of course, Jonadab had read the situation correctly. The rest of the king's sons were not dead, but there were still other results from the second story's conspiracy. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 34 to 39. But Absalom fled, and the young man who kept watch lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, many people were coming from the road behind him by the side of the mountain. And Jonadab said to the king, Behold, the king's sons have come. As your servant said, so it has come about. And as soon as they had finished speaking, behold, the king's sons came and lifted up their voice and wept. And the king also and all his servants wept very bitterly. But Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son day after day. So Absalom fled and went to Geshur and was there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom, because he was comforted about Amnon, since he was dead. Every son of David other than Amnon and Absalom were accounted for. They'd just taken the scenic route in order to lose a tail that was not following them. Because Absalom had fled to another kingdom. It was similar to David's own story, although David's running was because Saul had been the murderous one. Well, that and the fact that David was not a grandson of a king like Absalom is, which is why the prince ran to his grandfather, Talmai, king of Geshur. On David's side of the story, we see that he still mourned the loss of his eldest son Amnon. It took a while before he was completely comforted for Amnon's death, but it did eventually happen. And then, after 3 more years, David's heart went back out to his son Absalom. But notice again, there is no call for justice. At best, David was relieved that only one of his sons had died. He might have been very angry at Absalom for a time, but it led to nothing else. His own memories of a murderous conspiracy left him deaf to justice, gagged from speaking against another of the very types of sin that he had committed. And just like how we saw in chapter 11, that one bad choice led to another, led to another, led to another. So too, in the next few chapters, we'll see that one sin leads to another, which will lead to another, which will lead to another. The sins of the father are visited upon his children, unless he speaks truth, despite the hypocrisy. Whether you are a parent or not, don't let past mistakes, the sins that have been repented of and covered by the cross, don't let them keep you from calling out the sins of others, sin of the next generation. I mean, absolutely don't sit there judging other sins while you're doing nothing about your own. But in the areas of our sins where we have repented of and are working on them, we should never allow them to silence us from speaking into the sins of the next generation. Never allow our failings make us think that we're the last person who should be speaking up. In the areas of sin that we have witnessed the pain and loss and problems in others' lives, we are among the most qualified to speak. We have seen the detriment. Don't live through what we have. Don't make others live through what we have made them live through. We are able to explain the tragedy of our own consequences. We're able to speak in the first person as witnesses of the pain of others' lives because of our deeds. We're able to explain in visceral understanding how much is lost because of this sin. We have every right to speak up as long as we repented of it and begun to change our life in this area. David's adultery with Bathsheba and murder of Uriah had happened. There was nothing that David could do to change that, no matter how much he wanted to. But he was still able to, he was even responsible to, speak into his weakness for his children's sake. But he didn't. He allowed the shame of his failure that he had repented of, he allowed that shame to silence him in his children's sins. And because of that, he allowed his daughter's rape to go unpunished, and lost a son to the assassination of another, the second to die on account of the consequences of sin. And he will lose more still, as we'll see in the next few chapters. Learn from David by witnessing what not to do. Don't fear being called a hypocrite by your children. Instead, be a lesson of what it means to be forgiven, live with the consequences, and still continue in worship of our God. It is a far greater lesson for us to teach, because we will all fail. So we all need to learn how to fail well, how to never allow our own failures to keep us from the restoration brought about by God's King. Let us show the next generation the grace and mercy of Jesus by never fearing our forgiven sins. Let us not hide them. Never let them shame us into silence. Never allow justice to be unserved, just because we've been there. If we repented, then justice was given to us, even if the biggest consequence was paid by the cross of Jesus. If we speak the truth about our own sinfulness to the next generation, perhaps we can break the cycle of the sins of the father visiting upon the children. At least then there will be less human evil that brings about the problems of others' lives for which we are responsible. Jesus is there, ready to help us on our own loyalty missions, so that we don't pass on Daddy's issues.